In the 14th century, a terrible and eerie plague swept through the known world, leaving destruction on an unimaginable scale in its wake. It was the Black Death, one of humankind's deadliest pandemics. Europe at the time was full of people and interconnected, with filled-up trade routes and crowded city centres. But in 1347, just one outbreak in a Sicilian port town would trigger disastrous events. Over the course of several ensuing years, the plague would spread like a prairie fire and cut a groove of destruction across Europe and Asia. It killed entirely communities. It is estimated that the disease killed 30 to 50% of the continent's population. The Black Death was not just a purely medical crisis, but a cataclysmic event which would forever alter the medieval world's social, economic, and cultural tapestry. Its legacy lives on to this day. It is to this story of the Black Death, a tale unlike any other of unbelievable tragedy, but equally of resilience, adaptation, and the unconquerable human spirit when met with unimaginable adversity. Dark clouds loom over a medieval European city, foreshadowing the shivers to be sent down the spine as the plague whisks through thronging city streets, leaving in its wake trails of sickness, death, and despair. Then the music swells, and the dramatically set scene that is to present one of the deepest, most influential moments that ever was in human history is laid before the viewer. Origins and spread. The Black Death originated in the heart of Central Asia, likely in the Gobi Desert region, sometime in the early to mid-14th century. The causative agent was the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which thrives in rodent populations and is transmitted to humans through the bites of fleas. The exact origins of this deadly plague are still debated by historians, but many believe it first emerged in the Mongol Empire, which stretched across a vast expanse of Eurasia at the time. As Mongol armies and traders moved goods and people along the extensive Silk Road trade networks, the plague hitched a ride, gradually making its way westward. By the 1330s, the plague had reached the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea, a major trading hub. From there, it spread to the bustling ports of the Mediterranean, where Italian merchant ships unknowingly carried the infected rats and fleas to new lands. In October 1347, the first major outbreak occurred in the Sicilian port city of Messina, as ships arrived from the Black Sea. Over the next few years, the plague radiated outward from this initial point of entry, sweeping through Italy, France, Spain, and the rest of Europe at an alarming rate. By 1348, it had reached as far north as England and as far east as Russia. No corner of the continent was spared, as the highly contagious disease moved rapidly along the major trade and transportation routes. The plague also spread southward, devastating North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Caravans and ships carried the infection to the Levant, Egypt, and the Abbasid Caliphate, where it caused immense suffering and loss of life. Overall, the Black Death pandemic is estimated to have killed between 30 to 50% of the total population in the affected regions. The speed and scale of the plague's transmission was unprecedented, facilitated by the extensive commercial and cultural connections of the medieval world. As the disease ravaged city after city, it left behind a trail of death and despair, forever transforming the social, economic, and political landscape of Eurasia. How did the Black Death impact Europe? The Black Death had a profound and lasting impact on European society when it swept through the continent in the mid-14th century. Here are some of the key ways the pandemic transformed Europe. Demographic shifts. The Black Death was catastrophic in terms of loss of life, killing an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's total population. This led to severe labor shortages, as entire communities were decimated. In some areas, death tolls reached as high as 60 to 80% of the local population. Economic disruption. The massive depopulation caused by the plague had major economic consequences. Trade and commerce ground to a halt, Agricultural production plummeted, and many businesses and industries collapsed. Land values and wages increased as a result of the labor shortage. Social upheaval. The Black Death eroded the traditional social order and power structures in Europe. The disproportionate impact on the nobility and clergy undermined the authority of the feudal system and the Catholic Church. This contributed to the decline of serfdom in some regions. Religious turmoil. The plague sparked a religious crisis as people struggled to make sense of such widespread death and suffering. Many turned to extreme acts of piety, like the flagellant movement, while others became disillusioned with the Church's inability to stop the pandemic. Scapegoating and persecution. Minority groups, especially Jews, were frequently blamed and persecuted for the spread of the plague. Pogroms and mass killings of Jewish communities occurred across Europe as a result of these anti-Semitic sentiments. Cultural shifts. The trauma of the Black Death left a lasting mark on European art, literature, and music. Themes of death, the macabre, and the fragility of life became prevalent. The pandemic also accelerated the decline of the medieval worldview and the rise of Renaissance humanism. Overall, the Black Death was a cataclysmic event that reshaped the demographic, economic, social, religious, and cultural landscape of Europe for generations to come. Its legacy continued to be felt in the centuries that followed. Symptoms and transmission. The Black Death manifested in three primary forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague, each with its own distinct symptoms and modes of transmission. The most common was the bubonic plague, which was characterized by the development of painful, swollen lymph nodes called buboes. These would often turn black or purple, giving the disease its infamous name. Victims would also experience high fevers, chills, vomiting, and diarrhea as the infection rapidly progressed. In the septicemic form, the bacteria would spread directly through the bloodstream, causing the skin and tissues to turn black. The pneumonic plague was the deadliest, as it could be transmitted person to person through the inhalation of infected respiratory droplets. This form led to a rapid onset of pneumonia-like symptoms and was almost always fatal. The primary vector for the plague was the humble rat and its ubiquitous flea. As the bacteria thrived in rodent populations, the fleas would feed on infected animals and then transfer the disease to humans through their bites. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of medieval cities provided the perfect breeding ground for this deadly cycle. Once introduced into a community, the plague could also spread directly between people through close contact with the sick or dead. The lack of scientific understanding about germ theory and disease transmission at the time meant that medieval Europeans were powerless to stop the plague's relentless advance. With no effective treatments available, the vast majority of those infected succumbed to the disease within a week. The sheer scale of death and suffering wrought by the Black Death was simply unimaginable for the people living through it. Scale of the pandemic. The scale of the Black Death pandemic was truly staggering, even by modern standards. Estimates suggest that the plague killed between 30 to 50% of Europe's total population during the initial outbreak in the mid-14th century. In some of the hardest hit regions, the death toll reached as high as 60 to 80% of local communities. The devastation was particularly acute in the densely populated urban centres, where the disease spread like wildfire. Major cities like Florence, Venice, Paris, and London saw their populations decimated, with bodies piling up in the streets faster than they could be buried. Entire neighborhoods and even whole towns were simply wiped off the map as the plague ripped through them with merciless efficiency. The demographic impact was catastrophic, with entire generations being lost in the span of just a few years. The labor shortage caused by such massive depopulation had profound economic and social consequences as the traditional feudal order began to crumble. wages rose, serfdom declined, and the power dynamics between the nobility, clergy, and commoners shifted dramatically. Beyond Europe, the Black Death also ravaged North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia along the major trade routes. The Mongol Empire, which had previously spanned a vast expanse of Eurasia, was severely weakened by the plague's onslaught. Entire populations were decimated, and the pandemic played a role in the empire's eventual fragmentation and decline. The sheer scale of the Black Death's destruction was unparalleled in the medieval world. The loss of life was so staggering that it left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the affected societies, fundamentally reshaping the social, economic, and political landscape of Eurasia for generations to come. Medical and scientific understanding. In the 14th century, the medical and scientific understanding of the Black Death was severely limited, contributing to the pandemic's devastating impact. At the time, the prevailing theory about the cause of the plague was that it was a result of miasmas, noxious vapors or bad air that were believed to spread disease. This miasma theory was deeply flawed, as it failed to recognize the role of microorganisms and the true mechanisms of disease transmission. Without any knowledge of germ theory or the existence of bacteria, medieval Europeans were powerless to effectively combat the plague. They had no concept of the Yersinia pestis bacterium that was the true culprit, nor the crucial role played by rats and fleas in spreading the infection. As a result, the medical interventions attempted were largely ineffective, if not outright harmful. Common treatments included bloodletting, purging, and the use of various herbal concoctions and amulets, practices that did little to actually cure the afflicted. The lack of understanding about how the disease spread also meant that quarantine and isolation measures were haphazardly implemented, if at all. This allowed the plague to continue its relentless march across Europe and Asia, devastating one community after another. The sheer scale of the pandemic also overwhelmed the limited medical resources and infrastructure of the medieval world. Hospitals and physicians were quickly overwhelmed, and many fled in fear of contracting the disease themselves. Mass graves were hastily dug to accommodate the staggering number of bodies, further contributing to the sense of chaos and despair. Ultimately, the Black Death pandemic exposed the profound limitations of medieval medical knowledge and the vulnerability of pre-modern societies in the face of such a deadly infectious disease. It would take centuries of scientific advancement before the true nature of the plague could be understood and effectively combated. The lessons of this catastrophic event would shape the development of modern epidemiology and public health practices. Legacy and long-term effects. The legacy of the Black Death pandemic continues to be felt centuries after the initial outbreak. The sheer scale of the devastation and the profound social, economic, and cultural upheaval it caused left an indelible mark on the medieval world and shaped the trajectory of European history for generations to come. Demographically, the massive loss of life had a dramatic impact, with some regions losing up to 80% of their population. This labor shortage led to a decline in feudalism, as the scarcity of workers empowered peasants to demand higher wages and greater personal freedoms. In certain areas, the erosion of the traditional social order contributed to the rise of proto-capitalist economic systems and the gradual weakening of the feudal system. The Black Death also had a significant impact on the power and authority of the Catholic Church. The Church's inability to stop the plague or provide effective spiritual guidance during the crisis eroded public trust and contributed to the growth of religious skepticism and dissent. This paved the way for the Protestant Reformation, which would fundamentally reshape the religious landscape of Europe in the centuries that followed. Culturally, the trauma of the Black Death left a lasting mark on art, literature, and music. Themes of death, the macabre, and the fragility of life became prevalent, as exemplified by the emergence of the dance of death motif in art. The pandemic also accelerated the decline of the medieval worldview and the rise of Renaissance humanism, which placed a greater emphasis on individualism and empirical observation. Beyond the immediate impact, the Black Death also had long-term consequences for the development of medical and scientific knowledge. The pandemic's devastation spurred efforts to understand the nature of disease and develop more effective public health measures. This laid the groundwork for the eventual emergence of modern epidemiology, microbiology, and the germ theory of disease. The Black Death's legacy is one of unimaginable tragedy, but also of resilience, adaptation, and the transformative power of crisis. The pandemic's profound impact on the medieval world continues to shape our understanding of the past and the present, serving as a sobering reminder of the fragility of human civilization in the face of the unknown. The story of the Black Death is a sobering, profound chapter in human history, a testament both to the fragility of life and to human spirit. From there, with its toll on lives taken, to far-reaching social, economic, and cultural upheavals, this pandemic has left its distinctive mark down the ages. Well, the lessons of the Black Death remain relevant as ever as we grapple with the challenges of our own time. So a great way to remember our channel and to learn more about this great moment would be to subscribe and share this video so that it will forever change the course of the medieval world. For now, the Black Death's clouds start to part to show a world changed irrevocably by slaughter of such proportions as to be unimaginable at this plague's hands.